At 061 the wind shifted upslope without the pressure change that usually precedes it. I noticed because the loose grid on the slab above my shelter didn't move when it should have. Sound traveled, but air didn't follow. That mismatch doesn't happen often at this elevation. It means something's blocking flow or the ridge is shedding turbulence differently than yesterday. I marked the time and waited for confirmation. None came. Routine still held. I stayed prone until the sun cleared the eastern shoulder and warmed the stone just enough to stop the overnight ticking. I counted the gaps between distant impacts. Rockfall far downslope, ice fracture higher up, nothing close. The shelter remained invisible because it doesn't interrupt the skyline. My hands knew where to press. I didn't dislodge anything. That part still worked. The repeated sound from the last few days came again at 0718. Single clatter. Not a fall, not a slide. One stone contacting another, then silence. Today it came from my west, where the wind cut should swallow it. Instead it came back thin, delayed by maybe half a second. That delay matters. It means the sound bounced off a face that shouldn't be exposed from that angle. Either the wind was lying again, or something changed the geometry. I don't use fixed markers except where I need to return blind. The one I found turned this morning sits at the edge of a dead pocket where sound folds back on itself. I placed it months ago with a flat face aligned to a specific echo. It was rotated a few degrees clockwise. Not enough to be obvious. Enough to be deliberate. Freeze-thaw doesn't do that. Animals don't do that cleanly. I rotated it back and brushed the grit until my prints vanished. That cost me time and attention, which is a margin I don't like spending early. Water collection took longer because the shaded crack I rely on had less flow. Snowmelt is seasonal, but the drop was sharper than expected. I transferred in smaller loads to keep slosh down. Each trip was timed to gusts that masked movement. The ridge usually cooperates. Today the wind came in uneven pulses, like something was interrupting it. I adjusted my movement windows and accepted the loss in efficiency. The dead don't climb here. They respond to sound, and this place lies to sound. And that's been reliable. Living people avoid it because their cues fail. That's been reliable too. Reliability is what lets me sleep. The repetition breaks that. Same hour, different direction, same signature. If it were random, it would vary more. If it were natural, it would degrade. Instead, it's consistent. I cooked once, quickly. Alcohol flame, shielded, no smoke. I ate cold after. Calories in, no excess heat. I logged intake and felt the familiar lightness that comes from thin air and thinner margins. Midday I ran a passive test. I dislodged a pebble into a chute and listened. The echo returned wrong. Shorter path. That confirmed a change in reflective surface. Either a slab shifted, or someone stacked stone where there wasn't any before. I didn't go to check. Movement creates patterns even when you erase them. Patterns are what get noticed. Instead I mapped the sound in my head and marked the anomaly with timestamps. By late afternoon the wind normalized. The ridge sounded like itself again. That's worse than constant deviation. It suggests an intermittent cause. Before dark I found a second disturbance. Not a moved stone this time. A gap where I had filled one to stop whistle. The fill was gone. Stones were moved cleanly and placed downslope where they wouldn't rattle. That's an understanding of how this place works. That's not coincidence. If someone else is using the ridge's confusion, the cost isn't immediate violence. It's overlap. Overlap forces decisions. I can blend deeper and accept less water and worse sleep, or I can test the boundary and risk teaching them my limits. Ignoring it carries a quieter cost, losing control of the soundscape. Up here, that's equivalent to losing cover. I logged the changes and sealed the shelter tighter than usual. Night compresses sound. I need to hear if the repetition speaks again. The night stayed colder than forecast. Not unusual on a ridge, but the cold settled unevenly, pooling in pockets that usually vent. I noticed because my breath fogged longer on the downwind side of the shelter. That means air was stagnating where it shouldn't. Sound followed the same pattern. Distant noise carried clean, close noise smeared. I logged it as another deviation and slept light, waking on every false footstep my own heartbeat invented. At 0420 there was no clatter. That absence mattered. The repetition had been consistent enough to feel intentional. When a pattern breaks, it's either because the cause stopped or because it adapted. I waited until first light before moving, letting the ridge warm just enough to restore the usual expansion pops. Those sounds are baseline. Anything that cuts through them stands out. My first task was an audit. I traced my own movement corridors from the last week, checking for compression, disturbed lichen, microslides that would read wrong to someone who knows what to look for. I found one error. 3 days back I had stepped slightly offline to avoid a loose plate and didn't fully reset it. The correction I made then was functional, not perfect. From above, it would still look natural. From lateral distance, with patience, it would read as edited. That was my lapse. Small, but cumulative. Water was now a constraint, not just a chore. The shaded crack was still producing, but at a rate that forced longer exposure. I adjusted by caching a partial container in a secondary pocket closer to the shelter. That pocket has a bad echo. Anything dropped there sounds farther away than it is. It's useful, but it ties me to a fixed point. Fixed points create gravity. Mid-morning the sound returned. Same clatter, same single contact. This time it came from below the ridgeline, where sound usually climbs poorly. It arrived stronger than expected. That implies either amplification or proximity. I didn't move. I counted seconds, tracked decay, mapped the bounce. The source was closer than any of the previous instances. Not close enough to see. Close enough to matter. I ran another passive test, this time with my own body. I shifted my weight just enough to let a stone settle, something that would be masked by wind if anyone else were moving. The echo came back altered. Someone had stacked material in a way that redirected sound upslope. Not a wall. A guide. That's labor-intensive, and only useful if you plan to be here more than once. The dead don't build. That's an old conclusion, but it holds. Animals don't do this either. That leaves living people, which introduces a different threat model. Not immediate pursuit. Competition for silence, for water, for roots that don't announce themselves. The ridge can support one pattern without revealing it. 2 patterns start to interfere. By afternoon the wind rose hard enough to allow relocation, but relocation here is lateral and limited. There's no higher ground that doesn't silhouette. Downslope means noise and contact. I tested 2 alternate shelter sites I'd marked months ago. One had been altered, not occupied. Altered. Stones moved to break a sightline that didn't need breaking unless someone planned to use it. The second was untouched, but closer to the diminishing melt. I chose neither. Instead, I degraded my current site slightly, collapsing a non-critical stack so it looked abandoned from a distance. That costs concealment now, but may buy ambiguity later. Ambiguity is sometimes safer than invisibility when overlap occurs. Late in the day I heard something new. Not stone. Fabric, maybe. Brushing rock. It was brief and came during a gust, but it was there. Directionally wrong, like the sound had been thrown. That suggests someone else is timing the wind the way I do. Shared techniques reduce my advantage. As the light dropped, I realized the implied loss if this continues isn't just water or sleep. It's escape. My roots rely on the assumption that no one else is shaping the soundscape. If those routes are being learned or altered, my margins collapse fast. You don't notice it until you need to move quickly and can't without announcing yourself. I secured everything and went dark early. No flame tonight. Cold calories only. I positioned myself to monitor the dead pocket and the new guide surface. If someone tests me, it will be subtle. If they don't, that tells me something too. Either way, the ridge is no longer neutral. It's being edited. That means it's recording us both. Morning came with clear sky and no wind. That's a problem state. Still air at altitude turns every sound into a declaration. I delayed movement until the sun hit the far slope and created thermal lift. It took longer than expected. The ridge held cold like it was resisting change. When the first upslope whisper finally came, it was narrow and unstable, breaking apart before it reached my position. I didn't hear the clatter. Absence again. 2 missed cycles means the pattern is no longer passive. Someone is adjusting timing. Either they're reacting to something I did yesterday, or they're probing for response. I stayed flat and let the thermals build. When they did, I made a controlled error, shifted a stone that would sound like carelessness, not intent. The noise slid downslope and fractured into the usual false echoes. I waited. Nothing answered. Midday I committed to reconnaissance, but not toward the source. I moved laterally along a line that offers poor feedback, a stretch of broken talus where sound dies quickly. I erased myself as I went, resetting stones by touch alone. The goal wasn't to find them. It was to see what they'd changed elsewhere. Overlap leaves residue. I found it an hour out. A sequence of stones placed to dampen a natural rattle zone, not enough to silence it completely. Enough to make it sound farther away. That's refinement. I've done the same thing in other places. Seeing it here felt like reading my own notes written in a different hand. The work was clean. No wasted movement. Whoever did it understands cost. I didn't dismantle it. Removing it would announce that I'd seen it. Instead, I made a small counter-adjustment nearby, something that would subtly skew the echo. If they rely on that dampened zone for movement, they'll feel it. Not immediately, when they're tired or rushed. That's how mistakes surface. Water forced another decision. The primary crack was now borderline. I could maintain intake by extending exposure windows, but that increases detection risk. The cache I set yesterday was untouched. That's data. Either it wasn't seen, or it was seen and left alone. Both interpretations carry weight. I took only half and resealed it differently, changing the tactile signature so I'd know if it was disturbed without looking. By late afternoon, the wind came in hard from the north, strong enough to mask relocation. I considered shifting shelters entirely. The problem is that moving resets the balance. New place, new unknowns. Staying means negotiating a shared system. I chose to stay, but I reduced my footprint further, broke down a redundant stone break, accepted more exposure in exchange for less pattern. At 1703, the clatter returned, closer than before. Same single contact, but this time followed by a second, softer adjustment sound. Correction. Someone testing placement. It came from a direction that implied they were above me, not by much. That narrows the field. There aren't many workable ledges up there. I froze and let the wind do the rest. No response from me. If they're listening for confirmation, they didn't get it. After a minute, there was fabric again. Slow, controlled, then silence. The dead don't behave like that. They move until stimulus stops them. This was deliberate restraint. I logged the time, direction, estimated distance. The implication settled in slowly. The ridge can support one silent occupant easily. 2 is possible but unstable. 3 would be chaos. If someone else arrives, the system breaks and draws attention from below. That's the worst-case cascade. As night approached, I heard something that didn't fit any model. A low, steady hum, almost below hearing. Not mechanical, not wind. It seemed to come from the stone itself, like the ridge was resonating. It lasted maybe 10 seconds and faded. I can't explain it with known variables. I noted it anyway. Non-human anomalies matter up here. They change behavior over time. I went dark with no movement. Hunger stayed manageable. Thirst didn't. Tomorrow I'll have to choose between water and information. Both cost sound. If I misjudge, the ridge won't hide the mistake. I woke before dawn with my jaw locked from cold and dehydration. That's a manageable deficit, but it shortens tolerance. I recorded it because the margin matters now. The air stayed still longer than it should have. Even the birds delayed. When the ridge goes quiet like that, it usually means pressure is equalizing across faces. Sound flattens. Distance lies. I waited until 0630 before moving, later than optimal for water. The primary crack was down to a trickle that required patience I didn't have. Each container took minutes instead of seconds. I timed transfers to the faintest thermal pulses, but the masking was imperfect. Stone on stone still carried. I kept the load small and accepted the inefficiency. Halfway through the second fill, I felt vibration through my knees. Not impact. Not wind. A low-frequency transmission through the slab. It came and went without pattern. That wasn't human movement. Footsteps don't transmit like that unless someone is running, and no one runs here. I stayed still until it passed. When I resumed, I shortened the cycle and sealed the crack without taking full volume. That's a loss I'll feel tomorrow. On the return, I found a new change. One of my erased corridors had been compressed again, but differently than before. Not stepped. Pressed. As if weight had been applied slowly and redistributed. Someone testing load-bearing without committing. That suggests caution bordering on paranoia. Same mindset as mine. By mid-morning, the sun heated the upper faces enough to restore normal sound behavior. I used that window to audit my immediate perimeter again. That's when I noticed the sequencing problem. 2 of my internal time markers didn't line up with the sun angle I expected. Either my watch drifted, which I check obsessively, or my perception of duration was off. Fatigue can do that, but it usually presents as compression, not expansion. This felt like missing time. I sat and replayed the last 12 hours in order. There were gaps, not blanks but overlaps, events that seemed to occupy the same interval. I wrote them down anyway, out of sequence, and marked them with question symbols. The act of writing stabilized things. For a while. The clatter didn't come at its usual hour. Instead, there were 3 smaller contacts spread over 20 minutes, each from a different direction, each barely audible. That's not probing. That's mapping. Someone building a 3-dimensional model of the ridge's response. I stayed inert and let them gather bad data. I had altered enough surfaces that their map would be skewed, unless they recalibrated from scratch. Late afternoon brought clouds and a sudden temperature drop. Weather up here changes fast, but this front moved like it was sliding along the ridge rather than over it. Wind came in crosswise, breaking my usual masking lanes. I adjusted position inside the shelter and felt the stone hum again, stronger this time. It wasn't sound exactly, more like pressure with rhythm. It synced briefly with my breathing before drifting off. That's when the log breaks down. Time uncertain. Wind inconsistent sound returns before action. Stone warm, stone cold fabric. No, weight above Kai, below. I remember the ridge feeling crowded, like too many reflections occupying the same space. When clarity returned, it was dusk. My throat was dry to the point of pain. The shelter was intact, but one of the internal braces had shifted inward, reducing space. I don't know when that happened. Outside, a single stone sat where there hadn't been one before, placed to block a narrow sightline that only exists at sunset. That placement wasn't necessary unless someone knew exactly where I am. The implication is heavier than contact. It means observation without interference. Someone close enough to adjust my environment while I was compromised, or the ridge itself responding to load and temperature in a way that mimics intent. I can't rule either out yet. I drank the last of the cached water and sealed the container. No cooking, no movement. Whatever caused the disruption, human or not, it exploited fatigue and routine. That's a failure on my part. Tomorrow I either reset the system aggressively or accept that I'm no longer the only editor here. The ridge doesn't tolerate shared authorship for long. I woke with the sense that I had already been awake for hours. The log shows otherwise, but the body keeps its own records. My tongue felt thick, headache low and steady. Dehydration plus altitude does that, but there was something else layered over it, residual pressure, like the aftermath of vibration. The stone hum wasn't present anymore. That absence was almost louder. First check was structural. I ran my hands along the internal braces and contact points, mapping by touch. Everything held, but tolerances had shifted. Gaps I rely on for airflow were tighter. Others had opened. That can happen with temperature swing, but not all in the same direction. I didn't correct it yet. Correction erases information. I needed to know if the changes persisted. Sound behaved poorly. The ridge answered inconsistently, throwing back fragments instead of full echoes. I dropped a pebble deliberately this time, something unmistakably artificial. It should have bounced twice and died. Instead it returned once, sharp, then again delayed and warped. 2 different surfaces answering the same stimulus. That implies new geometry or a moving reflector. Water was critical. I couldn't afford another partial day. I moved early, accepting higher risk. The wind cooperated briefly, then cut out entirely halfway to the crack. I froze in place for almost a minute, knees burning, until a thermal pulse lifted just enough to finish the approach. The crack had changed, not dried, redirected. Melt was flowing along a hairline fissure I hadn't used before, one that leads away from my usual collection point. Someone could have diverted it with a stone, or a micro shift in the slab could have done it overnight. I took from the new line and marked it mentally, not physically. On the return, I found evidence of my own movement that I don't remember making. A corridor compressed cleanly, stones reset with care. It matched my technique too closely to dismiss. Either I did it during the disruption and failed to log it, or someone else mirrored my process deliberately. Both options are bad. One means my internal record is unreliable. The other means I'm being studied at close range. Midday brought another anomaly. A faint tapping, rhythmic, too regular for natural fall. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. It came from below, then later from above, same pattern. That's communication or calibration. I didn't answer. Answering confirms presence. Silence forces interpretation errors. The dead stirred downslope in the afternoon, drawn by something I couldn't hear. Their movement changed the sound field, adding noise where there usually isn't any. That's a secondary pressure. If they start wandering higher, it means something else is pushing them, or calling them. I watched dust plumes far below and tracked their direction. None came toward the ridge directly, but the frequency increased. By late afternoon the headache sharpened and my hands shook slightly when I tried to write. I simplified the log to keywords and times. Fatigue reduces language first. That's another marker. I ate cold and rested my head against stone, letting the ridge's temperature leach heat. The hum returned briefly, weaker, like a memory of itself. At dusk I heard movement very close. Not fabric, not stone. Breath. Controlled, shallow, timed between gusts. It lasted only seconds. When it stopped, I realized it had been positioned where I couldn't triangulate it inside a dead pocket. That requires knowledge you only get by testing. Repeatedly. I didn't move. If contact happens, it will be indirect. That's how this place enforces restraint. Direct confrontation breaks too many variables at once. I logged what I could and sealed the shelter as best I could without obvious change. I'm operating now under the assumption that I'm sharing the ridge with at least one other deliberate system. Whether human or something else exploiting the same rules is still unresolved. Either way, stillness is no longer neutral. It's a signal. Tomorrow I'll have to break routine in a way that costs something visible, to see who pays attention. I broke routine before dawn, not by moving far, but by moving wrong. At 05:05, with no wind and poor thermal lift, I displaced a stone along a line I never use. The sound carried clean and wrong, echoing downslope instead of laterally. It was an expensive mistake on paper. Audible. Traceable. It violated everything that keeps me unremarkable up here. I stayed exposed for 3 breaths longer than necessary, then reset only half the disturbance and withdrew. The response wasn't immediate. That mattered. If someone was close and watching, they would have reacted quickly, either to capitalize or to erase. Instead, the ridge stayed quiet for almost 40 minutes, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough to question whether the pressure I've been feeling is internal. At 05:49, the tapping returned. Same 3-beat pattern. This time it came from the direction of the deliberate error. That confirms attention, not pursuit. Assessment. Someone is correlating cause and effect. I stayed still until full light, then conducted a controlled relocation inside a narrow band I hadn't used in weeks. The path crosses a shallow saddle where sound behaves badly, echoes stack and cancel unpredictably. It's a place I avoid unless I need cover for obvious movement. Today I needed exactly that. I accepted the cost in effort and hydration. The saddle had changed. Not drastically. Subtly. A few stones repositioned to improve footing. Not for speed quiet. Someone had optimized it. That means they expect to use it again. Or they already have. I didn't linger. I degraded the optimization just enough to introduce noise under load, something that would betray haste later. Mid-morning the weather shifted again. Clouds moved in fast from the west, bringing a pressure drop I could feel in my sinuses. The ridge responded with scattered ticks and pops as stone adjusted. Normal. But layered under that was the low-frequency vibration again, stronger and more sustained. It ran through my chest this time, not just my legs. It synced briefly with the tapping rhythm before drifting out of phase. That correlation is new. I can't explain it mechanically. I noted it and moved on. Water forced another compromise. The diverted melt line was producing, but it required kneeling in an exposed notch. I waited for wind, then committed. Halfway through the fill, I heard breath again, closer than before. No fabric, no stone. Just air moving through a throat that knew how to stay quiet. I finished the transfer anyway. Breaking off early teaches observers where your limits are. When I turned, there was nothing. No silhouette. No displaced grit. But the sound field felt crowded again, like overlapping reflections without a clear source. That sensation persisted longer than before. It took effort to separate internal noise from external. I returned to the shelter and found another internal change. One of the braces had been removed entirely and placed outside, leaned against a rock in a way that prevented rattle. That wasn't environmental. That was access. Someone reached into my space without triggering collapse. That requires knowing exactly how it's loaded. That's no longer overlap. That's intrusion. I replaced the brace differently, altering the load path so any future contact would cause noise. It reduced my internal space further. Sleeping will be worse. But containment matters more now than comfort. By late afternoon, the dead below grew louder, more numerous. Their movement patterns shifted upslope in short bursts, then stalled. Something is drawing them incrementally higher. Not directly toward me, but closer than they've been since I arrived. If another occupant is moving differently than I do, less disciplined, they may be paying that cost. If so, the ridge will get noisier for both of us. As night fell, I made a decision I'd been avoiding. I prepared a false abandonment. I dismantled part of the shelter visibly, scattered stones in a way that suggests collapse rather than intent, and relocated myself a short distance into a cavity that offers worse acoustics but better concealment. It's not sustainable long term. It's a test. If the intrusion continues at the old site, I'll know observation was focused on structure, not presence. If it shifts toward me, then whoever or whatever is here can track through disruption alone. Either outcome narrows the field. Narrowing is progress, even when it costs ground. The ridge doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels monitored. Whether by eyes, ears, or something that only responds to load and vibration, I can't say yet. But the system is no longer passive. It's interacting. And that means the next mistake won't just be mine. The cavity held cold air like water. It drained heat steadily and made time stretch. I couldn't fully extend my legs. Every shift scraped fabric against stone, so I stayed mostly still and let stiffness set in. That was intentional. Discomfort keeps the mind anchored when perception starts to slip. I monitored the old shelter by sound alone. From here, echoes arrive late and distorted, but patterns still register. At 0820 I heard collapse noise where I'd staged it. Stones settling further one by one, like someone testing whether the failure was real. That took patience. Environmental collapse finishes quickly. This didn't. After the last contact, there was silence long enough to suggest evaluation. Then something new. A soft, sustained friction sound. Low amplitude. Almost like stone being rubbed rather than moved. It didn't repeat. It didn't travel. It just existed, briefly, and stopped. That doesn't fit human movement well. You don't gain anything by doing that unless you're learning texture or resonance. The hum returned not long after. Stronger. Longer. It propagated through the cavity walls and into my back. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was invasive. My teeth vibrated slightly. I focused on breathing slow and shallow, not matching the rhythm. Synchronization feels like compliance. Time became unreliable again. Blob fragment. Light present see absent sound before cause without record stone warm again. When clarity came back, the sun was lower than it should have been. I'd lost another block of time. This one felt longer. My water container was open, lid off, no spill. I don't remember drinking. The level was lower. Not empty. Measured. That's either restraint or coincidence. I don't believe in coincidence anymore. I checked myself for injury. None obvious. Pulse steady. Headache reduced, replaced by pressure behind the eyes. The cavity wall showed no new disturbance. Whatever happened didn't involve gross movement. I made the mistake of testing the cavity acoustics deliberately. I tapped once, lightly. The response came back immediately, too clean. Then a second response followed, delayed, from a direction that implies depth where there shouldn't be any. The ridge answered from inside itself. That's not human interference. That's the non-human variable asserting presence. Geological resonance can do strange things, but this was responsive. It changed after my input. I withdrew from the cavity at dusk, accepting the exposure. Better bad data than none. The old shelter site was altered again. Not dismantled further. Stabilized. Someone had rebuilt part of it, but wrong functional but noisy under load. That suggests either incomplete understanding or intentional sabotage. If it's a person, they want to force me to reveal myself by correcting it. If it's the ridge responding, then it's reasserting a preferred configuration. The dead below surged again as night fell. Their sounds layered oddly, some arriving before others that should have preceded them. Echo inversion. That means the sound field is actively distorted now, not just passively complex. Something is amplifying and redirecting noise at scale. I didn't return to the shelter. I stayed mobile within a tight loop, never stopping long enough to leave a signature. Hunger sharpened my focus. Thirst did not. I rationed carefully and logged each swallow to anchor memory. Near midnight, I heard a voice. Not words, not even a clear human sound. Just a tonal exhalation shaped by a throat. It came from above and below at the same time. It lasted one breath and stopped. No follow-up. No movement. That's the first time I've considered leaving without a clear route. That's dangerous thinking. Panic masquerades as decisiveness. I wrote that down and waited. If this is another human, they're leveraging the ridge in ways that exceed normal learning curves. If it's not human, then my presence may be enough to trigger behaviors that escalate regardless of intent. Either way, the cost of staying is no longer just overlap. It's participation in a system that's changing in response to me. Tomorrow I need to force resolution. Not confrontation, but boundary definition. The ridge can't stay ambiguous forever. Neither can I. I didn't force resolution at dawn. I delayed it on purpose. The night had drained me in a way sleep usually fixes. This time it didn't. My hands were steady, but the internal clock lagged. I kept catching myself expecting sounds that didn't come, then missing ones that did. That's a known failure mode in isolation work. Anticipation overtakes input. You start reacting to the model instead of the environment. I wrote that down to keep it external. The ridge woke unevenly. Sunlight hit the upper faces while the lower cuts stayed dark, creating a vertical split in thermal behavior. Sound moved upward but stalled halfway, like it hit a ceiling. That ceiling wasn't physical. It was behavioral. The hum was absent, but the pressure it left behind remained, a sense of loaded quiet. I chose a new test, not sound-based. At 075 I altered weight. I shifted a load-bearing stone in a place that affects nothing visible but changes how vibration travels through the slab. It's something survey crews do when they need to see how a face will fail without triggering collapse. The adjustment was millimetric. No sound, just redistribution. I then stayed completely still. The response took time, nearly an hour. When it came, it wasn't local. A distant rockfall downslope arrived muted, then sharpened as if something had focused it. That focusing tracked upslope toward me, then stopped short. Whatever is interacting with the ridge responds more to load than to noise. That's new clarity. Mid-morning I committed to a controlled reveal, but not of myself. I restored part of the old shelter incorrectly on purpose, making it stable but resonant. Anyone stepping into it would cause a low, unmistakable groan through the stone. I then withdrew laterally and waited in a position where I could feel vibration but not hear well. The wait lasted longer than expected. During it, the dead below quieted. Not moved away, quieted. Their sounds thinned until only isolated impacts remained. That suggests attention drawn elsewhere. Not to me directly, but to the ridge as a whole. Something was engaging at scale. The first vibration came through my left forearm. Sustained, low amplitude, increasing slowly. Not a step, not a slide. It felt like pressure being applied and held, then released, then applied again slightly offset. Someone, or something, testing the rebuilt shelter's response without entering it. That's boundary work. I didn't intervene. After the third cycle, the vibration changed frequency, and the hum returned, overlapping it. The two interfered, creating a beat pattern I could feel in my teeth. When the hum peaked, the vibration stopped. When the hum faded, the vibration resumed once more, then ceased entirely. That interaction matters. It implies two systems operating simultaneously, one applying force deliberately, one responding to aggregate load. They're not the same actor. That means I'm not dealing with a single intelligence, human or otherwise. I'm in a shared environment where at least one non-human variable reacts to stress, and at least one human variable is learning to work around it. That's worse than either alone. Early afternoon, I found confirmation. Fresh compression near the shelter that didn't match the earlier intrusion. Heavier. Less precise. Someone else had approached, triggered resonance, and backed off. The original intruder's lighter signature was absent. Overlap had become crowding. Crowding changes incentives. Silence becomes scarce. Mistakes multiply. I gathered what water I could without committing to a fixed route, and consolidated supplies into a single container. Redundancy costs noise now. I accepted the risk. I also dismantled the false abandonment fully, erasing the shelter's function entirely. No more bait, no more shared reference point. As the sun dropped, the ridge behaved more like it used to. Echoes normalized. The hum stayed gone. That suggests the system de-escalates when load is reduced and patterns are removed. It doesn't like edits. It tolerates them briefly, then pushes back. Near dusk I heard movement moving away from me, downslope and west. Not careful. Not loud either, just inefficient. Someone leaving under pressure. Whether pushed by the ridge, the dead, or another person, I can't say. But departure is information. I didn't pursue. Pursuit creates convergence, and convergence triggers response. Instead, I stayed low and did nothing until dark fully settled. The ridge isn't hostile in the way predators are. It's corrective. It resists sustained manipulation. Humans can exploit it briefly. Multiple humans accelerate correction. I've been assuming the primary threat was being seen or heard. That's incomplete. The real cost of staying isn't discovery. It's becoming a persistent load in a system that responds by tightening tolerances until something fails. Tomorrow I need to decide whether I can exist here intermittently instead of continuously. If not, adaptation means learning how to disappear in time, not space. I tested intermittence before committing to it. The idea is simple but expensive, presence without continuity. Let the ridge forget me between intervals. That only works if forgetting is real and not just perceived. I needed evidence. Before first light, I removed everything that carried my signature containers, cloth, even the oils from repeated hand contact on certain stones. I wiped those with grit and frost. I then left the immediate area entirely, moving downslope far enough to enter a different acoustic basin but not far enough to commit to descent. The move cost water and heat. I accepted both. From that lower position, the ridge above behaved normally. No hum, no pressure artifacts. Sound returned, distorted but predictably so. That suggests the system resets when load drops below a threshold. Thresholds matter. They can be worked with. I stayed away for 6 hours. During that time, I heard 2 separate disturbances on the ridge. One was careless stones rattling in sequence, too fast, too linear. The other was deliberate but heavy, with poor masking. 2 different actors. Neither moved like I do. Neither triggered the hum. That implies they didn't stay long enough or apply the right kind of load. Or the ridge had already shed enough stress to tolerate brief interference. By mid-afternoon I returned, but not to my original position. I re-entered laterally, touching nothing unnecessary, timing steps to whine bursts that didn't align cleanly. I wanted my arrival to look like noise, not intent. The cavity was unchanged. No missing water, no internal shifts. That's data. The ridge doesn't actively seek absence. It reacts to persistence. I stayed only long enough to drink and rest my back against stone. 30 minutes. Then I left again, moving to a second pocket farther along the ridge. That pocket had poor concealment but excellent thermal venting. I let myself be uncomfortable and visible to the environment if not to observers. The hum did not return. That's confirmation. The non-human variable, whatever it is, responds to sustained load and repeated manipulation, not to transient contact. It behaves like a corrective mechanism, not an observer. The human variables, on the other hand, respond to opportunity, stability, and reference points. Remove those, and they drift. Late afternoon brought a consequence I hadn't fully considered. The dead below thinned out. Their earlier upslope pressure relaxed. That means at least one of the humans who had been drawing them closer has moved on or gone quiet. The ridge is reverting toward baseline behavior. That's the apparent failure that turns harmless. Abandoning a stable shelter didn't expose me. It reduced system stress instead. Night fell cleanly. Sound traveled the way I expected to. Echoes folded wrong but consistently. I slept in 2 short cycles, never long enough to anchor. When I woke, I knew where I was without checking the sun. That internal alignment hadn't happened in days. There's still decay here. Water remains marginal. Weather will shift. Humans may return. Nothing about this place is safe in the permanent sense. But the ridge has clarified its terms. It doesn't want residents. It tolerates passers-by. My survival philosophy has always favored optimization. Make a place work, refine it, reduce waste. Up here, that's backwards. Optimization accumulates load. Load triggers correction. Correction manifests as pressure, distortion, and loss of time. Adaptation here means underfitting, staying sloppy enough to be forgettable, touching lightly, leaving gaps. Tomorrow I'll formalize the cycle, approach, extract, withdraw. No fixed markers. No improvements that last. I won't live on the ridge anymore. I'll use it the way sound does, passing through, breaking apart, never settling. That costs comfort and control. It buys anonymity and time. Time is still the only resource that compounds. I formalize the cycle at first light, not on paper but in action. Paper tempts permanence. Permanence is the wrong instinct here. Approach took place from the east. With the sun flattened shadow early, it makes judging movement harder for anyone watching. I came in high, crossed fast, touched only what I needed. Water first. Always water first. The melt line held steady overnight, but I didn't linger to confirm rates. Confirmation creates habit. Habit creates load. I counted breaths instead of minutes. 16 to fill, 4 to seal, 8 to reset surface noise. Then I withdrew before the ridge could register continuity. The second pocket behaved differently today. Warmer stone, faster venting. Sound died quicker there, like it was being absorbed instead of reflected. That wasn't the case earlier in the week. Either temperature gradients had shifted enough to change behavior, or the ridge was still shedding accumulated stress. Geological systems do that. Release comes in stages, not all at once. Mid-morning I heard human movement again, far and inefficient. Someone descending without understanding how sound stacks here. The dead responded almost immediately, their noise blooming upslope in short bursts. That's what happens when people treat the ridge like terrain instead of a system. I stayed out of it. Intervention creates entanglement. The hum didn't return, but something else did. A low clicking sound, irregular, like stone contracting unevenly. It tracked temperature change exactly. Non-human, non-threatening. I logged it as residual adjustment. The ridge resetting itself after too much editing. I ran a risk calculation in my head while waiting for another extraction window. If I stay intermittent, I lose redundancy. One container, one route at a time. Failure becomes sharper. But staying continuous invites systemic response. The math favors sharper, rarer risk over dull, accumulating pressure. That's a shift in philosophy I'm not fully comfortable with yet. Early afternoon I made my first mistake under the new model. I stayed 30 seconds too long at the waterline, distracted by a change in flow pattern. When I withdrew, the echo followed me longer than expected, clinging instead of folding away. That's feedback lag. A warning. I broke lateral and descended slightly to bleed it off, paying with effort and exposure. No immediate consequence followed. That doesn't mean none is coming. Delayed systems are the most dangerous because they train you to relax. By evening the ridge felt empty again. Not quiet empty. There's a difference. Quiet is absence of signal. Empty is absence of intent. I prefer the latter. I took advantage of it to rest longer than planned in the second pocket, letting my muscles loosen and my breathing deepen. I dreamed briefly. That hasn't happened in weeks. The dream wasn't narrative, just pressure and release, like stone settling into a better fit. I woke before it could turn into anything else. The dead were distant again. The humans, if they're still here, have moved laterally or left entirely. Without stable points to orbit, people drift. That's consistent everywhere, not just on ridges. I'm aware now that nothing I do here is invisible. It's just low impact enough not to provoke response. That's the ceiling. I can't improve conditions without raising my profile. I can't build without inviting correction. I can only borrow what I need and leave before the system notices the debt. Tomorrow I'll test a longer absence, a full day away. If the ridge remains neutral on return, then the cycle holds. If not, I'll have to accept that even intermittence has a half-life. Either way, this place has stopped being a home. It's become an interface. I left before dawn and didn't look back. A full day away was the next variable. And variables only mean something if you don't hedge them. I descended far enough to lose the ridge's acoustic influence entirely. Below a certain contour, sound behaves honestly again. Footsteps point where they come from. Echoes obey geometry. It's easier terrain in that sense, but noisier, more populated by consequences. The dead were thicker down there. Not clustered, just present, spread thin across the slopes where vegetation breaks stone. They reacted to sound normally: slow turns, stalled advances, the usual delayed pursuit. I moved only when wind or distance erased me. It cost calories and time, but not clarity. What mattered was what I didn't feel. No pressure, no hum, no sense of being recorded by the ground beneath me. Just gravity and fatigue. Honest systems. I stayed away until the sun passed its peak and began to slide west. That gave the ridge above time to cool, vent, and reset. If it was going to hold memory of me, that memory would surface on re-entry. I approached from a new vector in late afternoon, climbing obliquely rather than laterally. It's louder that way, but brief. The goal wasn't silence. It was transience. Crossing back into the ridge's influence felt like stepping into colder water. Immediate, total, but not hostile. Sound warped again, distance bent, but the system stayed passive. No amplification, no corrective response, no hum. I waited. 15 minutes, 30, nothing answered. The old shelter site looked like any other collapsed stack now. No stabilization, no testing marks. Weather had already begun erasing the edits made there. That confirmed something important. The ridge doesn't preserve human intent once load is removed. It only reacts to sustained interference. I drank, rested briefly, and left again without completing a full cycle. Incomplete patterns are harder to follow. As I moved away, I realized something I've been slow to accept. The other humans I detected weren't competing for the ridge itself. They were competing for stability. They tried to make the place behave consistently. That effort is what triggered everything. Dead movement, resonance, overlap, correction. I had done the same thing at first. I just did it more carefully. The non-human variable here isn't aware in the way animals or people are. It doesn't observe. It responds. It enforces a tolerance envelope. When pressure stays within it, nothing happens. When pressure accumulates, the system sheds it in ways that feel intentional because they're patterned. That realization reframes the earlier intrusions. The stone turned. The brace removed. The water diverted. Those may not all have been human actions. Some could have been the ridge redistributing load in response to subtle changes I introduced and didn't notice. I assumed intent because intent is what I'm trained to look for. That assumption cost me sleep, water, and time. I'm not certain which disturbances were human anymore. I'm certain now that it doesn't matter as much as I thought. The operational takeaway is the same. Permanence invites response. As night settled, I stayed out of the ridge entirely and watched from a lower spur. Sound up there folded and twisted on itself with no clear source. The dead didn't climb. No lights, no voices. Just a system at rest. Tomorrow I'll end this log. Not because the situation is resolved, but because it's defined. I don't need to record every cycle once the rule is clear. I'll pass through the ridge when conditions allow, take what I can without improving anything, and move on before continuity forms. Survival isn't about mastering environments anymore. It's about staying below their threshold for noticing you exist. This place taught me that by pushing back, not against me, but against the idea that I could ever belong here. This is the final part of the record. I waited one more full cycle before deciding to stop writing. Dawn to dawn, no ridge contact, no deliberate tests. I needed to be sure the conclusions weren't shaped by relief or fatigue. Patterns hold only if they survive neglect. They did. The ridge stayed neutral. No hum, no pressure artifacts, no sound behaving out of order. From a distance it looked the way it always has, broken, hostile, uninhabitable. That's its stable state. Anything that pushes it toward usefulness pushes it toward reaction. I made one last descent just after sunrise, brief and clean. I approached from below, crossed the water line, filled a single container, and left without stopping. No shelter, no rest, no adjustments. I didn't even erase my steps fully. I wanted to see if incompleteness registered as noise or simply faded. It faded. By the time I reached the lower spur again, the ridge sounded empty. Not quiet empty. The distinction matters enough to repeat it. Quiet invites listening. Empty discourages it. I drank and sat with my back against dirt instead of stone. The dead were present but uninterested. They drifted without urgency. Whatever had been nudging them upslope earlier in the week was gone. That pressure had come from humans trying to stay, not from me passing through. I reviewed the entire sequence from the beginning, stripped of assumptions. The repetition that started this wasn't a message. It was accumulation. Minor edits layered over time until the system responded. The ridge didn't learn me. It reacted to me the way it reacts to weather, ice, and fault creep by redistributing stress until equilibrium returned. The moments that felt like observation missing time, altered placement, intrusion, can all be explained by fatigue interacting with a system that distorts perception when you stay inside it too long. Altitude does that. Isolation does that. Stone amplifies it when you lean on it for stability. That doesn't mean there were no other people. There almost certainly were. But they were coordinated, and they weren't precise enough to account for everything I attributed to intent. I projected intelligence because I needed an adversary to explain loss of control. The real adversary was continuity. Living here worked until it didn't. Not because it failed catastrophically, but because it failed subtly through compression of time, erosion of margin, and increasing effort to maintain the same outcomes. That's how systems tell you you've crossed a threshold. The correction I needed wasn't better concealment or deeper stillness. It was withdrawal. Not retreat in space, but in duration. I won't return to the ridge as a resident. I'll cross it when conditions demand, take water when melt allows, and leave before the system registers a pattern. I won't build, mark, tune, or optimize. Anything that feels like improvement is debt. That changes how I think about survival everywhere else too. The old model, find a place, master it, make it quiet, assumes environments are passive backdrops. They aren't anymore. Too many forces, human and otherwise, are pressing on them at once. The ones that endure are the ones that aren't asked to carry weight for long. I don't need a safe place. I need places that forget me quickly. The ridge does that if I let it. This log ends here because the process is no longer changing. Repeating it on paper would be another form of staying. I've recorded the thresholds, the mistakes, and the correction. That's enough. Tomorrow I move laterally again, then downslope, then somewhere else entirely. Not to settle. Just to pass. If the world is going to keep reshaping itself around pressure, the only reliable way to survive is to remain light enough not to leave an impression.